click on it too early.
Well, I hope not. I mean, they need to be to work.
Yeah, and I guess we should double check the recordings.
Yeah, I know the recordings are working.
Okay, I told her just
Yeah, the recordings are for sure working. But the live stream is what we need to make sure. Okay, I'm gonna shut the door.
get started.
Yep.
And I'm being told that it's time to get started.
Yeah.
So I'm just going to do a quick welcome to everybody, and then I'm going to hand it to David to introduce our speaker for today. But welcome. This is the Energy Environment Forum. I have a usual spiel trying to encourage everybody to participate, ask questions, come up afterwards and talk to the speaker, talk to us. We want to get to know you. The forum is really, it's an event to try to build community among people who are interested in energy and environment and policy as it relates to that area. So please come introduce yourself. We've got listed up here some ways that you can get more involved if you like what you're seeing at the forum. There's things like graduate and undergraduate certificates to take classes around this area. The other thing that's just a sort of a marginal step from participating in the forum is that we have a graduate and undergraduate sort of reading group class where just in the weeks that we don't have a presenter, we meet and read the papers that are going to be presented. And so we, think about how different disciplines approach questions related to energy and the environment. And then there's opportunities to meet with speakers and things like that through that. So I would encourage you to have a look at that. There's one other thing I wanted to mention here. So the Baker School, I forgot my notes on this, Courtney, so you'll let me know if I leave anything out. But so over this year, we're taking the chance to take sort of the 250th anniversary of independence of the country to kind of look back at the institutions, markets, things like that across the history of the country. It's time to sort of reflect on sort of how we got to where we are, and then also to think about what that means for the country moving forward. And to sort of, we're doing that, within the context of the Baker School. You might be right, learning about sort of other perspectives and things like that. And so I think what you'll see is that our talk today fits very well within this series as well. The other thing I was going to mention is that we're already starting to think about next fall's Energy Environment Forum, and this is going to continue through the fall. So if you have any ideas or requests or things for us to pursue as things to sort of allow the Energy Environment Forum to fit within this, we're open to suggestions. So again, hopefully you can come introduce yourself, talk amongst yourselves after the presentation. Come talk to Greg, our speaker. And then we were just talking about it. If you do have clarifying questions throughout the talk, please speak up. We do have mics to pass around because there's people online who will only hear you if you have a mic. And then at the end, there'll be time for sort of deeper discussion, your hard questions, save them for after the talk. So with that, David McCollum is going to introduce our speaker for today.
Cheers. Thanks, Dale.
Clicker.
Yeah, so I'm David McCollum. I'm primarily at Oak Ridge National Lab, but I also have a joint faculty position here at the Baker School. And I've been helping to organize Professor Nemet's visit here. So it's really a pleasure to introduce a colleague and a friend, Greg, Professor Greg Nemet, distinguished professor at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, where he tells me spring has not yet sprung in Madison, right? So yesterday he was saying, this is really nice here.
Nice to be here.
Yeah. So really just in the last 10 days or so, it's just really sprung here. So no, it's great to have you here. So Greg's work sits at the nexus of, I would say, energy technology, environmental, climate, sustainability policy, technology innovation studies. And he operates, I would say, on one hand, in the empirical space, so making sense of historical data and trends in energy, technology, policy, but also on the other hand, and I think this is unique, bridging both worlds, in this more forward-looking modeling space, trying to understand where the world could be headed under different scenarios for energy, technology, policy. And Greg has focused a lot in recent years, so he'll show some of this in his talk today on solar power, carbon dioxide removal, so CDR, but he's done a lot in across the entire energy environmental spectrum. So Greg and I, we've known each other for about a decade, but we've gotten to know each other a bit more in the past few years, which has been great, both personally and professionally. Our overlap is this place, a research institute in Vienna, Austria, IIASA, the International Institute for Applied Systems Analysis, IIASA, where I spent the first part of my career, and Greg was goes there. He visits there quite often. He was just there last week, actually. And spring had not yet sprung there.
Right,
He told me. Yeah. So what I've always appreciated about Greg, and you'll see this in his talk and in the papers that he writes, which are excellent, he has this, I would say, uncanny ability to take a complex set of interconnected issues and just cut through to the core and then help the rest of us understand what's important there, why should we care, and how the rest of us should think about that. And that's a tough thing to do, as any researcher knows. So in this sense, I would say Greg is a true interdisciplinary scholar, and he represents the kind of thinking, this kind of culture that we're trying to cultivate here at the Baker School among the students and the researchers and the faculty. So for that reason, Greg was an obvious choice when a few of us were talking about, who could we invite to do an energy-themed lecture under this America at 250 umbrella? And Greg was an obvious choice. So Greg, we appreciate that you accepted our invitation. I hope everybody enjoys the talk. And with that, I pass it to Greg. So
Great. Yeah, thanks, David, for that very generous introduction. It's great to be here at the University of Tennessee. Great to meet the students, the researchers, and the faculty here. I have a junior in high school age daughter who's got Tennessee on her list, so I would report back, and I have very good things to say from my impressions here. So I feel like it'd be a cool place to be, and I think you're all lucky. Really nice to see this theme of the 250th, and so as a result, from speaking with David before my visit here, this will be a big picture talk about looking at some of the historical evolution of the energy system in the U.S. and some of the big history and big trends. And then I'll finish in the last few minutes on focusing on one technology that's really emerged out of the last set of energy crises in the 1970s, so on solar power. I guess a few things that I'll make sure to mention in this talk here. One is that there have been 3 transitions already in the U.S. energy system, and a big question for a lot of people is, what next? And so I'll set the stage with that. A second is I want to introduce this question, or build up to why I think it's an important question, is how can energy become a sustained social priority? And you'll see from some of the data I'll show that there's just a lot of volatility and booms and busts with energy, but the solutions really need to be solved with persistence. And that's the real, a big challenge that I see, and we'll talk about that. And as I said with solar, some of the seeds for the next energy transition were sown in the 1970s. And I really think there's an opportunity now with high energy prices, with a crisis in oil and natural gas markets, to do some of the big things that we were motivated to do in the 1970s because there was social consensus that there was an energy problem and we needed to do something about it. And so I hope we'll take the opportunity around the 250th. And interestingly enough, that I'll show in a minute, the last oil crisis, there was this initiative called Project Independence, and it was the 200th birthday at the time. And I'll even show you some text from a speech from President Nixon in 1974 that was talking about using the 200th anniversary or birthday of the country to start to really focus on our energy problems. And a lot did get done. So that's the roadmap of the talk, which I'll work through right now. Let's see. There we go. So here it is, 250 years of energy transitions in the U.S. And one of the things that I think is helpful just to segment it is for the first 150 years or so of the country, or 100 or so, we are a wood-based economy. This is 100% of the energy system was brought here, and almost all of it was wood. After that, the second energy transition, or the first transition, was to coal, the second energy carrier. And then after the World War II, the number one energy carrier was oil. And then what happens next is a question. And so that's what I kind of want to motivate, is think about what we want as our next. And I think my takeaway here is we probably don't need to be thinking about a single technology or an energy carrier as the answer to the fourth transition. but it's more what's the characteristic that we want, and find a bundle of technologies that I don't think has to be all about energy supply. It's about energy demand and supply and how they're connected and how people use it, that goes under a few characteristics that I'll introduce next. So that's the big picture, 250 years. Here's what I open my energy policy class on. So I have a lot of engineers in my class, and so they're used to things like first and second laws of thermodynamics, gravity, like laws that hold in all situations. And in social science, we don't really have those kind of things that we know are always true. So there's something that looks like it's true most of the time, called an iron law. So that's the best we get in social science. But this one I don't think there's any argument with, that when we do policy making, never one thing we're after. There's always multiple objectives, and so we often think about trade-offs and different interest groups and how we might combine different aspects, but multiple objectives. And in energy, we have multiple objectives, but I think we could simplify that and say that we all want energy that's some combination of cheap, clean, and reliable. And then the two things I'd say with that is, one, there's a bunch of characteristics under each of these goals that I'll unpack in a second. And two, we disagree about which of these is the most important objective. We might acknowledge that all of them are important, but which of them matters a lot. If we unpack it to cheap, we care about affordability. This is like a slide I put up when gas was like $2 a gallon. Now this is like something you could take today. This is a slide I've been showing for 20 years. I always have to explain where this is and what the countries are here, and I don't have to do that anymore. So it's really, we're living it now. But when we say cheap, we care about affordable energy. We don't want to have recessions that often come after oil price shocks, energy prices, and then the 2 billion people in the world that don't have access to modern energy. They're primarily using biomass and don't have access to electricity. We can think about clean. We can think about damages from unstable climate. That's long-term global, but near-term local. We also care about air pollution and health and kids not going to the hospital because of particulates and things like that. And for reliable, we want uninterrupted supply of energy. We want it coming from domestic and friendly places, and it's not just about energy. It's about negotiating positions on other issues that are all over the news today. So that's what we want: cheap, clean, and reliable. Where I come in with my innovation work is to say, wouldn't it be better if we didn't have to have such trade-offs among cheap, clean, and reliable, and all the different sub-goals that I just talked about before? Innovation has this potential to remedy these trade-offs, and instead of creating winners and losers in the system, find choices that can reduce the contentiousness of the trade-offs. And that, I think, is really kind of the political benefit of energy technology innovation, is that we could satisfy lots of different preferences for what they want from the energy system. But if we're thinking about using innovation to address this trilemma of cheap, clean, and reliable, we have to acknowledge some challenges. So one of them, and this is one, I think this is the second oldest power plant in the US. This is about a mile from my office in Madison, Wisconsin, built in the 19-teens, first powered by coal, then a combination of coal and municipal solid waste, and now natural gas. But it's still there, and that's so different from these things where people buy new ones every couple of years, or pharmaceuticals where people get new prescriptions every 30 to 90 days. That's one of the problems with energy innovation, is stuff lasts so long, and so we don't get a lot of chances to replace them just with normal replacement. That's one problem. If we think about the climate problem, such a different system than environmental problems that we've dealt with very successfully, like acid rain and particulates and those types of emissions that rain out of the environment in a matter of days and weeks. So you get a clean slate. If you were to put no more sulfur into the atmosphere, we'd have a pretty clean atmosphere within a few weeks. Not true so CO2, because it stays up there on average for something like 100 years, so 100 years or so. And then finally, going back to this slide, transitions haven't gone quickly. They've taken decades. Like 70 years is probably the number that you'd use. So if you say, I don't like the way gas prices are today, we need to transition away from those, this is kind of sobering in terms of thinking how long it would take till we have a system that meets the cheap part of cheap, clean, and reliable. So those are some of the challenges with innovation. Stuff, it was slow. And here's another big challenge, which is that if we're going to make a transition, we need persistence. We need to keep it up over long periods of time because we've seen it takes decades to do a transition. And part of the challenge here is if you look historically, we don't see persistence or consistent effort. We see volatility. We see interest coming and going, prices going up and down. I'll just show you a few pieces of that. So here's oil prices over the last, since the last energy crisis in the 1970s, so 55 years or so. Big periods of crisis here and here, a spike here, but probably not called a crisis. A financial crisis here that includes an oil price spike. Ukraine invasion was particularly important for Europe, less so in the US, and then what we're having right now. So you don't see consistency there. You see shocks and then busts and ups and downs and volatility. So that's one thing, prices go up and down. If we move into the realm of policy, this is build-outs of wind power in the US. And one of the problems we've had there is not consistent policy. And for the early part, this really critical part of the wind power industry starting, we had incentives that gave you about a 30% reduction in the cost of wind power with a production tax credit that would go off and have to be reauthorized by Congress every 18 months. So think about an industry where output goes down by 90% every couple of years. So the incentives to train people, to get to scale in manufacturing, to introduce new technology, you end up with a very short-term focus. And so that's really held things back, these incentives turning on and off. The other thing that comes up is people's expectations. And so one of the aspects of Project Independence for the 200th birthday of the US, President Nixon made this announcement that by 1980 that we wouldn't import any oil into the US, and this black line are the imports. And you can see we made some big progress around that period, but we didn't meet Nixon's target. Jimmy Carter had a much less ambitious target that we also didn't meet. And then we have this 20-year period of increasing imports. It's changed a lot since the end of the data on this period here, but it does keep this idea that maybe when we set targets, we're not necessarily going to meet them. And I think that's a problem with these long-term investments as well. And then policies change. Radical change from the most ambitious clean energy policy, legislation, the Inflation Reduction Act in 2022, to rolling back the majority of it just 3 years later with the One Big Beautiful Bill on last July 4th. So radical changes in terms of, and just thinking of what this does to people's expectations about what they want to do with their own personal transportation, or how they heat their homes, or how they fuel the electricity in their homes, or companies that might expand production, manufacturing, places around here of setting up new factories for these types of technologies when we have these radical changes in the policy world. I picked this up at some point talking to venture capitalists who pride themselves on being the most risk-loving investors in the world. They're willing to suffer, 9 losses for one blockbuster that comes through. And so I thought they might have a particularly interesting way to risk adjust this type of policy volatility and incentives that were coming and going. And so I asked them how they do that, thinking of trying to set up a model that I could use to how you could take a policy and maybe risk adjust it a bit. And I got a much simpler answer than I could model, is we just ignore it. So, and this was the venture capital saying, what the government giveth, it can taketh away. And this was more than 20 years ago, and we've still had this policy volatility since then. So it makes it really hard to think about how could we use policy to accelerate a transition when you have the holders of the capital that would facilitate this transition not trusting the policymakers. And then, so I think that's what's making things go more slowly than they otherwise might, even though some things are actually moving quite well. So I'll just sum up on this first part of the talk here, is that we need innovation to make energy trade-offs more appealing and less contentious. And that requires credible, persistent incentives. And so that's where I end up with this question of how can energy become an enduring social priority. And just to show you that it hasn't been an enduring social priority, these are counts of the word energy in the New York Times that students and I have updated. We do update this every year. And you can see when there was a crisis in 1973 and again in 1979, that there's a lot more coverage. There's a lot more public awareness of energy as an issue. And then it goes down quite a bit. And you have this 20-year period that in my classes, we spend quite a bit of time of trying to explain why from 1985 till about 2005, there wasn't much interest, there wasn't much policy making on energy at all. And so how do you set up energy so it's something we work on all the time in a persistent way to make long-term change rather than just when there's a crisis? So that's an ongoing challenge. I'll come back to this figure in a little bit and we'll look at the updated data. Okay, so going back to the crises of the 70s, because I think it is helpful to think about what's happened in the past to understand our current crisis and what's happening and the choices that are available. So one thing that's clear is that we've made a lot of progress in terms of an energy transition to something that's some combination of cheap, clean, and reliable. And a lot of it has its roots in the energy crises of the 1970s. So 1973, Arab oil embargo, prices go up substantially in October 1973, and I'll talk more about that one. And then 1979, the Iranian revolution, where prices go up again. So in just this 7 or 8 year period, you've got 2 periods where prices really jump up. And so there's a lot of public concern about energy. And I guess the other thing to think about too is before 1973, energy was really abundant. Like we really didn't worry about having enough energy. We were building lots of power plants, but we weren't being particularly careful about using it. We weren't very efficient in how we consumed energy. We were taking oil and putting it into power plants in a big way and making electricity just from burning oil, which is probably not the highest value of this, what became a very scarce resource. So we went from abundance to scarcity very quickly, and that catalyzed some policy making. And probably the biggest speech on energy is the State of the Union speech in 1974, and it comes as President Nixon announces Project Independence. So we were just talking about our America 250. This was the same idea. We're going to have a big, and he said it, I didn't actually print it here, but right before this passage here, he says, in recognition of our 200th anniversary of this great country, let us press vigorously on toward the goal I announced last November for Project Independence. So Arab oil embargoes, October 1973. In November of 73, he says we should have Project Independence. And here it is in the State of the Union address in 74. Let this be our national goal. At the end of the decade, year 1980, U.S. will not be dependent on any other country for the energy we need to provide our jobs, heat our homes, keep our transportation moving. So that was that dashed line from 1974 to 1980 of zero oil imports. And then there's a funding aspect to it. So to indicate the size of the government commitment, spur R&D, we plan to spend $10 billion in federal funds. So, something like $40 billion, $50 billion today, in today's dollars. Over the next 5 years, an enormous amount. But during the same 5 years, private enterprise will be investing 20 times that much and even more after that. So it's this government action to catalyze private sector investment was the plan. And just to put it in perspective, Project Independence is coming on the heels of previous successful big government R&D projects. So the Manhattan Project in the 1940s was kind of on the same scale as what he was suggesting for Project Independence. The Apollo Project similarly had a target, so announced in early 1960s that by the end of the decade that we would put a man on the moon, and it did. It was an expensive project, but successful. And so Nixon sees the Arab oil embargo, gas lines, we're going to do something about it, and we're going to do it with technology the same way we dealt with World War II and the same way we dealt with Sputnik and winning the space race and putting a person on the moon. And then you can kind of put it in the context of some other R&D projects as well. So Project Independence is a big effort here on energy R&D, and some big things came out of it. One big change that happened is we stopped, for the most part, putting oil into power plants. And so it was a rapid change that probably is mostly a price response here, but just think about that for an energy transition of really getting away from oil and relying more on coal and later natural gas for power plants. And a lot of, in this period, power plants get physically repurposed to burn natural gas instead of oil. It was pretty hard to actually put coal into a oil burning power plant, but you could do it with natural gas, and a lot of that happened. So that was a big change that helped. Second thing, I remember reading in grad school David Green's paper on why CAFE worked, and I still assign it to my students today, but doubling the fuel economy of cars within about 10 years. The graph doesn't go back to the time of the oil crisis, but miles per gallon was about 15 miles per gallon, and we get it up to 27 by 1985 through some combination of prices and standards that said companies, when you put all the cars they sell together, had to be above a certain level. But this starts to show what we've seen in a lot of other places is we get active in the crisis, and then we just stopped, and we didn't increase the fuel economy standards after 1985, and you can see the oil price or the gasoline price going down over that time too. But that made a big difference in terms of our oil imports. Another thing we did was efficiency throughout the economy. This is a really dramatic picture. This is energy use per refrigerator in the US. So refrigerators using more and more energy. And then after the oil crisis, you start putting in these standards, a lot of them from a first mover. That's often a characteristic of energy innovation, with California putting in standards that eventually become federal, and big declines in how much energy refrigerators are using, even as refrigerators get bigger and bigger. And we had those types of standards on lots of different appliances throughout the economy. Here's another thing that was tried, and in a way you could say it didn't work at all, but it maybe was an insurance policy. And so if you think about it, so this is taking fossil fuels that we had lots of in the 1970s, coal and natural gas, and making liquid fuels out of them. And so this is a plant in North Dakota that takes natural gas and turns it into liquid fuels. And the idea is that we would do about 2 million barrels a day by 1992 with a public-private independent corporation called the U.S. Synthetic Fuels Corporation. And they basically never produced any oil at all, even though about $4 to $6 billion of these $1979 go into building a few plants in Colorado, the Dakotas, and also in California. But part of the idea was, this is the first oil shock. Here's the second oil shock. And if you look at price forecasts after the shock had eased, it was going to double again. And so in this world of $80 a barrel oil, which in today's world is above where we are today, this actually might have made sense. It might have actually been a pretty productive way to use our domestic resources and deal with oil prices. It would be not good on a greenhouse gas emissions basis for sure, but in terms of just oil imports, it could have been helpful. But big change happens in 1985 where oil prices go down. So this goes from being an insurance policy or a way to deal with maybe a third of the oil crisis to something that becomes a boondoggle and really becomes one of the biggest justifications for this idea that comes up politically just after this, which is that the government shouldn't pick winners. The government shouldn't choose technologies. It should leave it to the market to decide. And there was a lot of corruption involved in this project, and it was the government deciding on a technology that ended up being obsolete because of the way the market progressed. So that was one thing that didn't work in the 1970s. Oh, too bad about this one being blurry that way. But I guess on the way, what I really care about is that left one, which is this big change that happened in this oil crisis context, which is in October 1985. I know some of you I talked to at lunch were doing this OPEC game in your class. Okay, so understand the issue of cheating in OPEC, and then the other side of cheating is punishing cheaters. And that's what Saudi did in October 1985. And so they increased their production by almost 50% in just 1 year and kept increasing it for the next several years. And so oil prices crashed and stayed low for 20 years. And that really led to reduce the incentives for innovation and alternative technologies, including the syn fuels that I talked about before, but also coincided with, that says federal energy R&D, which a big crash. So that was really the end of Project Independence, was just a couple years before this, was to really reduce what went into to energy R&D in that period then. But some of the outcomes here start to look like there really was an effect here. So this is a projection of overall energy consumption in the US from this mid-1970s, so between the two oil crises. And basically you have primary energy consumption of about, about 70 quads going up to over 200 quads. So more than a tripling over this time period here. And at the time you had this alternative, what's called a soft energy path. That was this article by Amory Lovins talking about using efficiency and using smaller technologies. And it just sounded, I think, to most people like not a serious way to deal with an oil crisis. So there's an oil crisis, there's geopolitical issues, we need to keep the economy going, keep gas lines under control. And he was saying we just need to deal with making pipes straighter and finding efficiencies throughout the economy. And so he said if we did all these things, we could end up on this, not a hard energy path, which is what industry expected, but a much shallower path. And the amazing thing is that he was pretty close to where we are today. So we're using way less energy than we would have if we were on the path that was the general consensus in 1975. And in part, it's because of the oil crisis and some of the things that happened then. The price signals that led to lots of changes in behavior, the efficiency standards on appliances that led people to reducing it, and just lots of opportunities to use energy more efficiently throughout the economy. And so we end up in a place that looks much more like the soft path than the tripling that the industry expected. And so there was something of a long-term effect of this crisis, even though the crisis really ended after about 10 years of intense activity. And you can see it in some of the data here as well. So if we look at, on this one, how much the country spends on energy, so in the neighborhood of $1 trillion. After the energy crisis, we really come down from that peak, stay low, and then it goes up again later. If we look at it as a percent of everything that we spend money on in the economy, then it has been this downward trajectory, not only from the crisis levels, but from the pre-crisis levels. So all of this efficiency or growth in parts of the economy that don't use energy as much really has had a long-term effect. So there really has been some positive things that have happened in terms of not making the energy cost to our economy affect all of the things that we want to do with our resources. And the other thing that's changed, and this is something that I've just noticed in the last few years, is I used to use this graph to make this point that people don't care about energy all the time, that they only care about it in crises, and that there was this 20-year period where it's much lower. And it's not only lower, like this is an imperfect measure. This is measuring the word energy. And when you look in the articles that mention the word energy, there's dance performances that have a lot of energy. So there's a lot of irrelevant things in this baseline here. But after 2000 or so, something is happening, at least in this measure of public discourse, where we're not just dealing with crises, but there's some kind of generally increasing awareness or capture of this idea. And we have had a few crises. The 2008 financial crisis was a recession that people talk about, but what was really important was this big spike in energy prices right before that crisis in 2007 that Doesn't have clearly one explanation like the Arab oil embargo or the Iranian Revolution, but the rise of China seems to be, and demand for energy in China seems to be a big driver of that, and then the Ukraine invasion too. But maybe there's something where we have the capacity for more persistent attention to this issue now, because something has changed. There's maybe more awareness. It's not just something that goes away when prices fall, for example. We'll see. Another big change, and this again is, I like to put it in terms of expectations. So the blue line is coal consumption in the US. But what I think is more interesting to me is projections of coal consumption by the US Department of Energy. And I remember being, working in this area in 2005, and that was the general consensus, that we'd been increasing coal and that it was going to keep increasing, and that a whole world was going to keep increasing coal. And that was really motivating a lot of people to work on carbon capture and sequestration for coal. And that turned out to be the peak around 2005. And coal production started going down. The forecast didn't start to go down. They just started from a lower level and kept going up. So it takes a while for expectations to change. But then they did. Sometime around 2012 or so, the US Department of Energy forecasts really start to forecast a decline of coal, and those continue. And then we did these expert elicitations in 2020 of where experts thought coal would be in 2030, and we ended up lower than the EIA's estimates. And coal has continued to come down. I think last year it was a little bit up, but the general trend has been to change. So that is a transition. That's a big change that we've seen just in the last 20 years on coal. And then this is the last slide of this section that I put out. This is also signs of a transition. If we look at the last 25 years and look at how much new electric capacity the US puts on the grid each year, in the first 5 years of this, it was all natural gas. Natural gas was cheap. We'd just gone through restructuring. There's a lot of incentives to have small, flexible plants. And so it was more than 90% natural gas from 2000 to 2005. Then wind power starts to play a role and comes into the picture and plays a pretty big role from 2005 till 2015 or so. And then we've got this small source that starts growing and really starts to get substantial somewhere around 2020 and then keeps growing from there. And then we have this completely new thing that almost doesn't even make sense to think about it as electricity generation, but we're putting it on the grid, which is storing energy. And if we put solar and batteries and wind together as some combination of clean technology, that's more than 90% now. Even in 2025, which is with the new administration, which was much more focused on natural gas and a little bit on coal. So that, I would argue, was also some of the seeds for wind and solar, probably not quite batteries, but I do know at least for wind and solar, are set in some of this project independence work where nuclear, synthetic fuels, other big technologies were the core of the effort, but some of the money went to these new technologies like solar and wind, and they had big payoffs, even though they occurred much later. So I would like to spend maybe the last 10 or 15 minutes of my remarks and then just move to questions of just talking about where this came from and making some connections to the 200th birthday and Project Independence. So let me talk briefly about my recently revised book about how solar energy became cheap. And the first thing I tell people, it's still important to make the case, is to show this long-term trajectory in the cost of solar, about a factor of 10,000. So there really were people paying $300,000 per megawatt hour for solar in 1957. Anyone guess who was doing that? Yeah, close. It was the US Navy for a satellite. So in 1957, the Russians launched Sputnik. So that really launched the space race and this idea that the US was behind and we need to throw everything we could. And so the US really wanted to get a satellite up. It's launched the Vanguard 1 satellite in 1958. And there was a few different ways that they could put the telecommunications in that satellite. A lead acid battery, some people thought maybe a small nuclear reactor. But it turned out that a small solar cell was the most cost-efficient, lightweight, efficient way, even though it was really expensive energy. But it's come down since then. And I want to talk a little bit about how it's come down, and it's really gotten into the range of fossil fuels at this point. And that's what's making it get as much market share as it has of new generation. And so this is if I had to do one slide on this answer to this story of how solar energy became cheap, it would be this one. Factor of 10,000 fall in costs, lots of different countries involved, but if you had to say in one sentence, I would say that the US created the technology, Germany built the market, and China made it cheap. And there were some really important roles that were played by the US, by a laboratory doing the basic science in the 1950s, by Nixon's Project Independence in the 1970s, these standard offer contracts in California in the 1980s, and then the Inflation Reduction Act coming up later there. But other countries played a role as well. But let me just talk about a couple of the roles for the US, a little bit on Germany, and a little bit on China, and then a little bit on implications. But this is the story that, I don't know, maybe this is true for a lot of industries, like the car industry maybe looks a bit like this now. But this is this long-term trajectory of shifting leadership on who's making solar. And the US was the by far dominant producer of solar in the 1970s, albeit when solar was tiny. Japan gets into it. US has another heyday later on in the early 1990s. Japan and the US go back and forth. Germany plays a really important role for a very short amount of time. And then China just takes over when it starts to sell to the German market. And then India, who wants to become a solar manufacturer and has made really big strides in scaling up its manufacturing and wants to be self-sufficient on solar, wants to be able to do a lot of solar for its electricity and make all of that domestically and not rely on China. And it's pretty much on the way to doing that. But that's just India supplying India. China supplies the whole world. And so this is this really dominant role that China's playing in making solar panels for China. So if China makes 80% of the world's solar panels, China uses half of the world's solar panels, installs them in China. So 2/3 of that chunk of China is just going to be installed domestically, and the rest goes to other places. Here's the Project Independence role. So this is this US creating a technology. So this is funding for R&D, a small amount of the $500 billion that Nixon was talking about in his State of the Union speech. But for solar, it was transformative. It really made a huge difference. And one of the biggest things is it entrained people into the solar industry. It pulled them from the space program. The Apollo project had recently ended, so there was good talent available. From the electronics industry, people started working on solar and stayed in it for several years. And then in 1981, those budgets just get slashed. There's a change in administration, a change in priorities, and a change to say that the US shouldn't be funding technologies, it should just be supporting science. And a lot of this really was on technology development rather than basic science. And then we've had a solar budget since then, but never returned to the levels of Project Independence. This, I think, is one of the most important figures for understanding solar. And this is not an academic. This is the person that led the US solar program in 1975, made this picture. I just took all his figure and modernized the graphics, but this is all his data except for the 2023 number there. So this is Paul Maycock. He's one of the people that gets entrained by Project Independence, working at Texas Instruments, making calculators and other small electronics. And they realized, the way he put it, is that the cost would come down as they built more, and it was a really great way to connect the marketing people who knew how to find new markets for the technology and the engineers who knew how to make the technology better and optimize the manufacturing to make it cheaper. And this idea of a learning curve, that costs come down as you build more, worked for calculators. And they could measure how much benefit you'd get. And so for calculators, 20%. And the 20% refers to if you double the cumulative volume of calculators that you make, you reduce the cost by 20%. And so he said, maybe solar works the same way. It looks like semiconductors. Maybe it's the same thing. So he took the data, going back to the Vanguard 1 satellite, and some other sales that happened in that time, and just fitted power functions. So log scale on horizontal of cumulative capacity, and log scale on price there. So factors of 10 of each of these tick points there. And you fit a power function to it, and it looks like a straight line. And he said, well, it might be slower than calculators, so just 10% reduction when you double, or it might be faster. And as you see with 2023 numbers, he was right on, and for whatever reason, we've ended up on the nice side of the learning curve, like fast learning. And batteries for electric vehicles are even faster than this one. So solar has been a good story, but it's not the only story. The other thing that Paul Maycock was prescient about was saying, we don't have to just wait with these costs. This horizontal axis here, that can be a function of intentional policy. And he sort of said, he did say, here's where we are today in 1975. If we want to get to a target around here, that's where he thought that solar could actually compete with coal and natural gas and beat them on electricity. We might need to subsidize solar. And he created this triangle of subsidies that you would need to buy down the cost of solar. And I think the thing that's not always appreciated about this learning curve idea is that we're not subsidizing solar just to have a lot of solar installed. Like, that is an outcome, and you get benefits. There's employment, there's air pollution impacts and benefits from that. But the real reason to subsidize it is so you don't need to subsidize it anymore. If you can buy down the learning curve and get to here, there you're starting to create social benefits that pay back those subsidies because of the log scale. These numbers are way bigger than all this stuff that you paid for. And so once you get to start undercutting fossil fuels, the subsidies argument can make a lot of sense. So this is the learning curve from 1975, and we've really followed it. The other implication of the learning curve is that it's not just about funding science, funding R&D, funding technology, which the US is really good at, but you also want to subsidize and fund demand. And that's what the US did in the 1970s as well, is to say, we're going to buy solar panels. The US government's going to be a customer, and whoever you are, SolarX is one company, Spire, General Electric, we'll buy your solar panels. They have to be a certain efficiency. They have to last for a specified number of time. And we're going to keep increasing the requirements. So how efficient it has to be, how long they last, et cetera. And we had these series of block buys, tiny amounts of money in terms of that $1 billion of R&D, but it gets the industry to be serious. They start to say, okay, we have to go from just one by one artisanal manufacturing of solar panels to setting up a production line and making them work pretty well so that the Department of Energy will buy them. And they did this through 1981, and it was working pretty well. And then with the budget cuts, there weren't the 6th and 7th block buys that there were supposed to be. And so the technology went elsewhere. And that was part of the problem, and maybe the sad part of Project Independence, is that by shifting to other priorities, the technology frontier went elsewhere. And the first place it went was to Japan, and the second place it went to was Germany. And Germany played its pretty important role for a while. And I guess the 4 points that I would make there is that there was this policy window, sort of like we had the crises in the 1970s. In 1998, there's this political coalition of the Greens and the Social Democrats, and they picked renewables to really push. Really, it was wind, but then solar came along for the ride. And as they put together a policy package, and they were the policy entrepreneurs, they took ideas from the US, so these standardized contracts where you guarantee a price for purchasing electricity that California had pioneered in the 80s, and this idea from Japan that the prices could come down over time, the rebates, the subsidies could come down over time, under this idea of a learning curve, that you wouldn't have to subsidize as much as the prices went down. And they just supercharged it. They made it, California had a 10-year contract, Germany says 20 years. California paid a little bit above the retail price. Germany paid like twice as much as the retail price. And then it did come down over time. And the key thing too is that it created this market where solar worldwide was about $2 billion, and Germany made the global market $10 billion in just a few years, and then $40 billion after that. And just going back to this idea of expectations and investment, again, also the main outcome of all that money, $200 billion of taxpayers' money, it's not just to get a lot of solar panels installed everywhere, it's to catalyze the learning curve. And partly what it did is it created this market. Looks interesting enough that you could make special saws for cutting silicon wafers. So before that, the solar industry was just taking ideas and spin-off machinery from the computer industry. But now you could do things just for solar because the market was big enough. And that really laid the ground for big cost reductions that came later. Unfortunately for Germany, not from Germany, but from China, that was watching this market and had a few entrepreneurial companies get interested in it in the early 2000s and jumped in. And it wasn't the central government at all. It was scrappy entrepreneurs trained in Australia, as it turns out, go back to China in the early 2000s, raise money privately, and they had to raise like $5 million. Like, you know, that wouldn't cover a building around here, $5 million, but that was the birth of the Chinese solar industry. And it only was later that the federal government or the central government actually supported the solar industry in the global financial crisis. But what did China do? They took advantage of global knowledge. So they had these Chinese that had been trained in Australia and went back to China and brought knowledge with them. You know, at one point in the early stage where the scale up was really happening, you had US teachers' retirement funds, pension funds, with their money going into the stock market. Some of that money was going into Chinese solar companies that were going public in the New York Stock Exchange, taking that money. So this one company, Sun Power, raised $300 million in its IPO. So this is basically teachers' retirement money going to China. They take that money and they buy equipment from all over the world, from the US, from Switzerland, other places, take those machines back to China, make solar panels in China, and then send the panels to California, to Germany, when those subsidies went away, to other places like the UK and Spain. And so you really had this global flow of knowledge, of capital, of products moving around. And that was a big part of China's rise. Automation. So early on, China had this labor cost advantage, but that goes away, and it's really about optimizing machines and getting them to work together. Competition. So I don't have this slide with me here, but when US was dominating solar, the biggest company in the US had a 30% market share. Same for Japan. Sharp had more than 30% market share. No Chinese solar companies ever had more than 15% market share. It's just the margins are much tighter. There's a lot more competition, a lot more acceleration of integrating new techniques and new manufacturing technology. So that competition has been important. And then having their own supply chain and managing the cost of the input materials has been crucial too. And then just the scale, again, logarithmic scale here, and you can see how these companies scale up. But part of this is this ambition. And one interview I did with a participant in the German solar industry, trying to understand or explain why it all went to China. And he said, well, one of the reasons was that when the Germans were still thinking in megawatts, the Chinese were thinking in gigawatts. There was this idea of it's going to be big. There was ambition. There was a sense of being surrounded by growth. There was a tolerance for overcapacity, because if you built too much capacity and couldn't sell it all, within a couple of years, you'd use that up. And whereas that would have been punished in the US and harshly punished in Germany, it was just part of the deal in China that you could have overcapacity, because that would give you scale and the ability to invest in automation and gains that came later. And so those were some of the things that China really benefited from. So yeah, just to close here. So if you look at the cost of solar, it's this 2/3 of a century now of a learning curve of costs coming down consistently over time and staying on this trajectory. And it really does seem like the factors that are in play now have the potential for further cost reductions. And this is one thing, I just did this calculation recently a little bit for fun, but if you just look at the materials now, this is dollars per meter squared. If you want to do square foot, you could multiply by 10 or multiply the denominator by 10. So it's $3 a square foot for a panel. But it's about $3 a square foot for a piece of plywood. And I mean, this was just done on a spreadsheet to compare. But I mean, last week I was going for a hike and I saw this house that was doing that in real life. Like their house next to it had a fence that was wood and wire. And they found that you can just make the fence out of solar panels. And maybe you get some electricity, but the main thing is you can keep your pets inside your yard because the material has gotten so cheap. So it really is in this kind of strange world where the materials costs are so low. So if we look at global picture here and energy transitions going from wood biomass world to coal to oil to one where gas is biggest, you then kind of wonder if solar keeps going, where does it go? And we don't know. Here's a few different outcomes. There's ones, this is probably Secretary Chris Wright. This is his scenario. It sounds very similar to what he suggested, where the growth stops and flattens and we just don't have much more solar within a couple of years. You could take another model, which would just be linear growth. So just add a certain amount of solar, the same amount of solar every year. So that stops growing, but you just keep adding it. Or you do these exponential curves. And just be I mean, who knows what's going to happen, but just to be clear about this is if you take the growth rates over the last 40 years, which have averaged 30%, and just keep it going. And this is if you take the growth rates over the last 40 years and halve them, so it only grows at 15% instead of 30% a year, and this is where you get. And so I think a lot would have to change to get to the Secretary Wright's scenario versus the other ones maybe looking more realistic, especially if you look at what the drivers are right now. So lots of reasons for cost reductions to continue. A second is that we've got complementary technologies that kind of work well with solar, like batteries have the same cost trajectory. They just continue to getting cheaper. Grid integration sounds like a problem for a lot of solar. It's not sunny at night. It's less sunny in winter, etc. But there's a whole bunch of solutions to that. And all of these have some technological dynamics too. Energy storage, faster than solar, getting cheaper faster than solar. Transmission, so that's more challenge of public acceptance and investment and putting transmission in. But also there's technology there that allows you to do repowering of existing lines and have bigger capacity, or dynamic line ratings so that you can actually put more power through than you would with a constant capacity assumption. Other renewables, wind and solar are not correlated. So if you put those on the same system, that's a lot better than just having solar. You could have demand that's responsive. So not just have demand that gets a flat price all the time, but maybe has different prices. And in contrast to what I learned in grad school is that energy's plentiful at night, but it's scarce during the day. Solar maybe flips that. And so maybe you want to have activities that start to happen more in the day in a solar intensive area. Digitalization, so having information throughout the system, that allows consumers to start to have more prices, maybe more control, or just have more automation so that their devices run when power is cheap, for example, and also allows people to run the grid better by understanding how the grid is functioning, where there's congestion happening, forecast things like clouds and wind so that you can predict on a more precise basis. And then some role for clean generation that's available all the time. So you put those all together and you can have a grid that is cheap, clean, and reliable, and all of those things have aspects of them that are getting better and making them more feasible. So new uses and new users. Solar seems to have strong social license compared to other technologies, not uniformly, but in pretty good compared to others. Demand for electrification we've seen, and this investment shift we've seen to clean energy as well. I'll just put this up. This is some new places and new uses for solar. And then the one aspect on this graph that I would emphasize is that growth rates are faster in the global south. So just to be clear, solar is not a luxury good. It's not a technology for rich countries or rich people. It's becoming a place where countries that don't have good grids or that have limited capital or high cost of capital find solar appealing. Pakistan is probably a really good example, but you can see some of the other countries on this list too. But the solar in the global south is growing faster than in the global north. Yeah, so I guess I'll just finish up with some of the implications. Mainly is now is a time to prepare if we want to transition and take advantage of this particular resource. Finance is important, siting and permitting is important, grid integration is important, and valuing some of the health and climate costs from fossil fuels is important as well. So that's my last slide here. Continue learning and adoption are creating the transition to a solar-centric economy. So it's up to us if we want to benefit from this opportunity. So I'll leave it there and look forward to your questions as well. Thanks.
Cool. Yeah, that was a great talk. Let's we'll pass the mic around. We have about 15 minutes for questions. Did somebody have a question down here?
The great talk. Thank you very much. And you started out talking about the past energy transitions, and then moved on to the oil crises, and now this solar transition. I would say the past energy transitions maybe even include, there's not really a transition associated with the oil crises, but the past transitions are largely a function of private interest. In other words, there is a different energy source that is better from a market point of view.
Yeah.
Cheaper, does more things, and so on. And so the motivation is largely driven by the marketplace. Here we are thinking about a transition, I would say, largely for the public good. How do we address climate change in particular as the main driving force? But there are other things. All this is more complicated, as you pointed out. There's air quality, there's so on and so forth, energy security, et cetera. So on the one hand, we see a market-driven transition. We're trying to accomplish a transition for a public good. Could you sort of comment on how that affects the public policy decisions that might be made and the kinds of actions we take?
Yeah, maybe three things come to mind. So first of all, it does put a bigger role on policy, because we're not just talking about a private good, we're talking about multiple public goods: air quality, climate, security, economic resiliency, a bunch of things. That's one. Two, there were some public goods associated with the previous transition. So we had national security being an important public good, and oil being an important to fueling the British Navy, and that was a big transition that happened. So there were aspects that were public that were not connected to health, for example, or climate, but national security. So there was part of it that's been important with energy that's not just about markets. And then three, I think it's an open question about to what extent this technological progress that we've had, especially in batteries and solar and digitalization, those three are really the core ones. Do they mean that we can use a lighter hand because we have some market-based drivers here? And so we still need policy, but not to the extent that we would have 20 years ago when we had almost no electric vehicles, solar was expensive, and digitalization was really in its infancy. So still a role for public policy, but a bigger role for markets than there used to be, even with these additional criteria that we care about.
I'll just make a reminder for anybody who's listening online, you can enter your questions and we can ask them here in the room. But since I have the microphone, I get to ask a question first. And so you've given this great narrative about energy transitions and the role of R&D and long lags. And I think, unless I missed it, you managed to get through that entire talk without mentioning the word regulation.
Oh, right. Yeah.
Which has also changed drastically since the Arab oil embargo.
Yeah.
How do you think about parsing out deregulatory or changes in regulatory factors and pure R&D? And so it's kind of to David's point, right? Historic transitions have been driven by superior technologies. He's interested in policy. I'm sitting right next to him thinking about other kinds of policy in the form of regulation and just how you would tease those two effects out.
Yeah, I mean, policy, like say federal policy, Inflation Reduction, for example, or the One Big Beautiful Bill kind of going the opposite direction. Those are helpful for guidance and creating an overall framework and direction of travel, I would say. But then so much of it happens more locally, like at state level with regulators, but even local level with like who's going to put a solar farm in your community and do you want that or not? And that comes down to often local decisions. So yeah, there are all levels involved. I mean, one observation I've had is that the place that has had the most solar and batteries going in the last few years is the one where I think it's fair to say that markets have had their way more than any other with like the fewest restrictions, and that's like Texas. And that's where we've seen by far the most batteries and a lot of solar as well. And so I think there's something to learn from this diversity of different approaches we have state by state. But certainly if we're thinking about especially things like rooftop solar and integrating storage in people's vehicles with their own energy consumption, that's a different world than we have today. But I do think there's a lot of opportunity there. But that needs, there's an engineering problem there, but there's an incentive problem there that's very different from almost anywhere that we live today. Like, for example, could you have an electric vehicle connected to your solar panels and electrified smart house and sell electricity to your neighbor or trade electricity with your neighbor? Like that's nowhere in the US is that allowed right now, but seems like these technologies are going to make that feasible. And why not? What are the reasons not? And that's probably a discussion we need to have because forces will go there as we start to have really high regulated electricity rates. People are going to start looking at things like that. And maybe it's not households, but large employers that maybe want to do some of that themselves. So yeah, certainly an important part of it. Let's see. Yep. Oh yeah.
Thank you. Thanks for the talk. I was curious, your case study of solar is so interesting in terms of like the combination of the technologists, the kind of market craft, and all of these kind of policy instruments that across the world, right, led to this situation where we can be relatively optimistic about solar. I'm curious, are there other technologies in your kind of innovation work that like if you were advising a government that you would say, we ought to kind of emphasize policy and industrial policy around these particular technologies going forward, whether that's, advanced nuclear, fission, more solar stuff. I don't know, just anything.
Yeah. I mean, I think one distinction I made, because I've been engaged in conversations like you just suggested, hypothetically, and there are a set of technologies that tend to have these characteristics like very standardized, fairly small, so they're mass manufactured. Solar panels are like that. Batteries, they could be in electric vehicles or for stationary power or other things are like that too. And there's others that maybe are around that area, like heat pumps, where there's not a lot of complexity to them. They're pretty standardized. Those ones are pretty good at getting the learning by doing and the economies of manufacturing scale. And so in a lot of ways, I would say, let's push on those as much as possible. It doesn't completely solve all our problems. We need power at other times. We probably need longer term energy storage. That isn't going to happen with these tiny lithium ion batteries. So there's other things we need to do too. So those need different models. So I think solar is gives you a playbook that you could use for things like heat pumps or electric vehicles or these small granular technologies. big technologies, some carbon removal technologies, maybe large nuclear power, they just need different models, and we need to learn from other things that have went well. But even the ones that have gone well, none of them have gone fast like this and fallen in cost like this. So yeah, you need different models for these other kind of archetypes. Oh, there's a question.
I'm interested. Yeah, I'm interested in wind and where wind's coming in on this. So, 10 years ago, maybe even 5, the Inflation Reduction Act, huge investments in wind, huge infrastructure, doesn't last very long, and it looks like it doesn't even show up when I'm seeing these curves. I'm just curious, is wind going to be an afterthought in in our energy future?
Yeah, it's a good question. No, I don't think so. Wind makes solar work so much better because the resources are not correlated. Like it's windy and it's sunny at different times, and that works really well together. So they're a good pair. The second thing, the other thing I would say is that wind like set the stage for so much of the takeoff in solar. Like it was always cheaper than solar until recently, until the last 10 years. And so all these policies, renewable portfolio standards, the feed-in tariffs, the regulation in California, all were directed toward wind. And solar really benefited from having that already established and then making solar take advantage of it. But the last thing I'd say about wind is it hasn't had the same learning curve. So it's gotten cheaper over time, but about half the rate. So that's why it's kind of lost versus solar in terms of competitiveness, but it does different things and it's really useful. I think the frontier of offshore wind is really interesting because there's a lot of countries in the world that have don't have much land but have access to offshore. And so what's happening in the UK with offshore wind and how the costs have come down after this kind of last couple of years of higher costs looks really encouraging. So yeah, I think wind's interesting as well. It's just not as dramatic a story. I did my master's in undergrad studying the similar story for wind, and it was also interesting because solar was still not that interesting at that point. So yeah, wind's a good story too. Just it hasn't been quite as dramatic. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks so much for your talk today. So I've heard people talk about things like grid inertia in the context of solar, but I've only really ever heard that if you're coupling solar with batteries. Can you elaborate more on how we can use or how solar affects things like grid inertia and whether or not batteries is the only real way to increase grid inertia with solar power? Yeah,
so your idea of grid inertia, so if you have an outage or a partial outage in the system, in the past you have spinning generators that continue to go for a little while, or you have a little extra capacity that you can boost, right? And so that works with thermal energy like natural gas, coal, and nuclear, but not with solar. And so you have to do some kind of substitute for that inertia. And so putting batteries all over the system is a pretty good substitute for that. And if you were going to have a lot of solar, that's a really smart thing to do. A lot of that's happening in Texas right now. I just did a discussion with someone. A lot of that's happening in Turkey right now. Like every solar installation has to have batteries with it in Turkey, so they've got tons of batteries there. South Australia, which probably has more solar than anywhere, has batteries all over. A place that didn't have it is Spain, and so when they had an outage a year and a half ago, they didn't have the inertia, they didn't have the system to support all the wind and solar they had on the grid. So yeah, it's an important issue. And so one thing I'd say with that is like you can't just do solar. You have to think about the whole system: transmission, storage, complementary renewables, digitals, all the things that I listed there too. So yeah, that's an important aspect of it.
Cool. I guess we might have time for one more question, so I might go ahead and ask it if nobody else has a question. No? Okay, so my understanding of like the justification of subsidizing things that have learning by doing is that a lot of that learning flows to like other companies and stuff like that. So one company does the innovation and it goes more broadly. I'm wondering if that's so that curve you're seeing there, is there evidence of that it's both within firm and across firm? And then I'm also wondering then if you step back to this policymaker or country level, it seems like part of the issue with the Germany to China thing was a lot of that learning externality actually went from one country to another. And so even from a policymaker's perspective, should we be thinking about ways to try to keep more of those benefits locally, or does it work better if it flows both ways, et cetera?
Right. Yeah, good question. Right. So I guess behind your question is saying there might be learning effects, but if a company can capture all those effects, they'll just do it themselves and get all the learning. So yeah, there are spillovers. I mean, these are devices that are simple. You can buy them, reverse engineer them. You can't reverse engineer the process for manufacturing them. That's harder, and that's kept quite secret for that exact reason, but there's some spillover of it. The other company-to-company spillover that seems to be the case is the installation stuff. So I've talked mostly about hardware, like a solar panel, but how you put them on a roof, and as workers learn how to do that. Some studies we've done shows like the workers are pretty mobile, so they take their tacit knowledge about how do you install a solar panel well, affordably, and quickly. They can just easily go to another company. And so there does seem to be some clear channels of spillover, both for the devices and for the tacit knowledge in people's heads. The country-to-country spillover, I mean, on one hand, it's a great thing. I would think is that China's doing all this investment in solar, and the whole world gets to have cheap solar as a result of it. And so one of the explanations that you talked about, Germany kind of losing its industry, I remember asking someone of that, and their explanation was, well, that was our gift to the world. We spent $200 billion subsidizing solar, and now we're saving, literally on the order of $1 trillion in climate change mitigation by having low-cost solar. And so on one hand, they did their job, and the benefits go to the rest of the world. But the other thing is, China being the dominant manufacturer of solar, would anyone in the U.S. really want to have that role? Would a company in the U.S. want to be making solar panels where the margins are tiny, if they're positive at all? And the thing I think about, I talked to a person who did manufacturing in China, and he was saying at the beginning of my time here, we were always trying to hire people from the semiconductor industry because they knew how to deal with semiconductors and silicon and do those types of installations. Now, and this was 5 years ago, I would never hire someone from the computer industry. I'd only hire someone from the garment industry, making t-shirts, because that's the sophistication of solar now, and that's where the margins are. So I guess the way I come away with is, why not let China make all these solar panels for cheap? And it's not going to be, if they decide not to sell them to us, we're not going to have gas lines. It's different from the 70s that way. So but it's an interesting kind of economic competitiveness question, and who should subsidize these technologies if the benefits are going to go elsewhere. Great. All right. Thank you all. Enjoyed your questions, and good talking to you.
Thank you.
Yeah.